All right, thanks. Thanks for that. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I didn't realise this was your first thing of your year, so that's quite. Well, it's quite exciting to start people off in the direction of good trouble. So I just wanted to show you a few of the things from my background to give you a bit of a picture of what I've done in the past, because pre-XR I made a lot of career choices that made me poor and made my life interesting as well. So before I sort of became known in this way, I was working in kind of, I now look back and describe it as a kind of pioneering approach to upcycling and using reclaimed materials. At the time, I used to say we make clothes out of old rubbish and try to make them nice. Quite often, if you say to people you make recycled clothes, they assume that they're not very nice. So this was a label that I ran with a friend of mine, Good One. We used a lot of knitwear. It was a label that we tried to evolve as a kind of design philosophy, if you like, or an approach to the design for the mass manufacture of what we used to say was the mass manufacture of the one-off. So we wanted to make garments that were unique because they were made out of unique pieces of reclaimed materials that you could only get once, but broadly speaking, you could unify them enough to help them to sit easily together on a rail or to sell them more easily to buyers who at that time, this was, I think, 2009 collection, buyers really didn't understand what it might mean to buy into something that wasn't always going to be exactly the same. And a lot of commercial interests were struggling with problems with the quality issues that you have, for example, when you use recycled materials. So we focused in on a lot of things that you could find loads of. So things like this Aran knit bomber jacket, things that you could say, well, this is a very special piece of knit. You know that the cables and the patterns are always going to be different, but they're all going to be broadly the same. So if you can buy a massive sack of them, you can make lots of those jackets and they're all beautifully kind of different, but the same at the same time. So trying to make it possible to sell. And from there, I went into working with a textile recycling charity in London called Trade. And this was a place where it was much smaller recycling facility that I had access to. And I started to work a lot more with print and things that were that I could piece together one at a time, because you really, if you plan to use recycled materials and you're relying on print, it's extremely challenging because you just can't get the thing that you need to make the garments. Anyway, that was a very small collection. I was only there for a short amount of time. And then I went on to work on this technical women's cyclewear label, which I launched, which as a product developer was very good. And I made myself practical cycling jackets that worked really well for me as a female cyclist. But as a one-woman business, I was not very good because I'm basically an anti-capitalist and I don't like selling things. So the purpose of this was to create a jacket, basically, and then a small collection around it, which was based around kind of slow design, trans-seasonal design, so things that are modular but not gimmicky, things that come apart but because it's useful, and tailoring, sort of styling, and using things like black reflective materials and stuff that would make it feel smart, so that you could arrive by bike looking like you were going into a serious meeting and not, apologising for your appearance. So this was quite a sort of a turn for me from being a fashion designer or thinking that I have to work in fashion to really repurposing myself quite a lot as a product designer. And it was a bit of a liberation in a way. I'd say the next step after that that's worth talking about anyway, because I did lots of other things, but the next step was also to sort of go, actually, what if I want to repurpose myself as an artist? And I started to work with a friend of mine who's on the screen there on the right hand side, Miles, who I'll talk about again later. But we decided that we sort of wanted to create an art project together, and this is pre Brexit and pre-Donald Trump. And living in England at that time, we were both sort of sensing something was very much not okay in the world, and anticipating needing to come out much more loudly and strongly in resistance and against things that are happening socially and politically. Both of us have got a background in various kinds of activism, creative activism and stuff like that. But it felt important for us to sort of somehow forge a project which made an urgent response to our times. And that project became this thing called Body Politic, which was about wearing a message. And the first thing that we did a lot of was painting jackets, so getting secondhand garments, mostly leather jackets if you want to paint on them nicely, and trying to turn them into a message which would utilise the body as a site of political struggle and communication, and to be able to then think about what you might want to have more conversations with strangers about, what you might want to protest about, what you might want to talk to somebody on the bus about after you've finished marching down past Downing Street or whatever it is that you're taking part in. And the scene on the right hand side was the first ever workshop that we did on a grass area in Brixton in South London. And it was just the very first attempt that we made, I think, at sort of holding a workshop space. And so from there, we became very interested in this idea of the workshop, a communal space for making, for doing, but also for talking. And it was quite clear that the average person, in Britain at least, but probably lots of other places in the world, has got very, very, very poor textile hand-making craft skills. So if you hold a textile-based workshop for the public, you will find it quite difficult to get them to make something that's good, or finish what they start making to a good quality. And this is where, I suppose, like Extinction Rebellion, not really realising it, my thinking had gone to participation design. So thinking about how do people engage in this space, and how do we design the way that they do that so that they can do it in a meaningful way, so that they can leave with something they've made that's finished. How can we support the engagement of people if they can only come in for an hour or 2 hours? We also started to source more and more reclaimed garments. So we were wanting to use clothing that already existed and materials and objects that already existed and repurpose them to make new meaning in the world, rather than creating new stuff out of new materials. So the jacket that you can see on the left-hand side, that's the back of a denim jacket. And we managed to source a whole load of prison denim jackets. They were like made in prison by prisoners as uniforms that they would then wear. And the Textile Recycling factory that I used to use had them and couldn't get rid of them because they're very big sort of square shapes and nobody was buying them from him. So it felt very beautiful to me to take those garments and repurpose the uniform of the oppressed into something that we were sort of jokingly called the uniform of the sort of liberation movement, or, you know, the uniforms of activists. And on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of a workshop that's happening in a sort of very beautiful community centre in Dalston in East London. And that was where one of the first times we came out with all these patches. And so the participation of people is much easier if they've got something they can sort of grab and stick onto something, rather than the very, very labour-intensive work of like applying single letters and sewing over it and making it all so that it will stay on and survive the wash and the wear. So this was exciting. And at the same time, we also had a practice in these workshops, which was quite difficult. We didn't do it in that one because it was too busy. But what I would like to do in a smaller workshop was always have a little library of books. And so at a quiet time, somebody could pick something up and read to the rest of the people that are taking part. Or you could invite people who know I was part of a reading group at the time, so we could invite those people, and something we're reading a difficult, critical feminist text or whatever, and say, okay, I'm going to bring in Audre Lorde and I'm going to read this to you, or I'm going to bring in Bell Hooks and I'm going to read Bell Hooks to you whilst you're doing your sewing. So it's about thinking about how you engage the kind of brain and the body and the hands all at the same time to create a sort of learning experience where people are also sort of producing something of value. And we took this around and toured it to different places. This is an arts centre in Denmark. And so the patches became quite simple things to do, because you put this cloth tape. If anyone's ever worked in the film industry, there's like an amazing, because I don't know why, I just love it so much. There's an amazing array of colours of like cloth tape that you can buy that they use on set. And if you stitch that onto a garment and put it through the washing machine, it survives totally fine. So it's a really simple way, because it sticks itself in place and then you stitch over it. So it has quite a nice punk aesthetic in a way. And you can also use the tape to make the letters themselves. So you can write whatever you like, but you could also use our patches. And the other thing that I think is kind of interesting that I remembered whilst I was looking at the bits and pieces to include in this talk was that we started off with a live document, and we were both reading a lot of different stuff. And I would say, like, I was reading, like I said, I was part of an all-female reading group, and we were actually reading a book list at first, which was from a British publisher called Dry Your Eyes and Organise, and that was in response to Donald Trump's election. And Miles was reading things like the Tao Te Ching and lots of kind of ancient philosophy, and there's some really ancient kind of Eastern anarchist texts and stuff like this. What fascinated me at the time was that the word we came back to again and again was empathy, and also other things like you saw on the jacket, compassion, humility, deeply unfashionable words. Words that belong with religion and spirituality. And to me, that was interesting because it felt that the items that rose to the top of that list, and it was a long, long list on a live document, were, there was something about them that was like a longing that we had, that was like the longing for these things to matter in our lives, and the longing for us to be able to assemble our politics around them, but also to be able to talk to somebody on the bus about them as well. That's an example of one of Miles's pieces from kind of later on. And obviously the sewing part becomes quite difficult. So one of the things that I can also recommend if you do want to design workshops like this is to get those hand crank sewing machines, because if you have those, say we've done these things in like museums and stuff like that, if you have totally random people from the public come up and they want to do some sewing, if you've ever done that work, you'll know that when it starts to go wrong, they put their foot down more instead of take it off, and then the machine's like jammed and you spend all your time trying to sort out the machine. But what you can do is force them to be slow and these machines don't go so wrong. So that's like, and they're quite cheap to buy usually, so that's my top tip. Anyway, in the meantime, whilst I was doing that, I was also became friends with somebody called Roger Hallam, who's I'd say the most controversial member of Extinction Rebellion probably, but he was studying a PhD at the time about how to design effective radical campaigns. So this is also something interesting, I think, for people who don't know much about our movement, is that you can look at some things like Me Too comes out of a hashtag, right? Or like the moment that we've just been through with Black Lives Matter, where you have a trigger event that kicks something off. And we didn't have any of those things that started off Extinction Rebellion. We had like a sort of a long period of like intentional kind of design. So a lot of things about the way XR's set up was able to be on purpose in a way which lots of other movements don't have that luxury, because they're responding to something that requires you to do something fast. If you're dealing with something that's been ignored for about 100 years. You can take 6 months to decide how you're going to do it, you know. So Roger was doing this research and reading revolutionary history and thinking about non-violent strategies and how do they work. And meanwhile, there was other people in the UK who were also organising in a decentralised way with different activists, doing different mini campaigns of non-violence, direct action, civil resistance, that kind of thing. And I was part of several campaigns which involved breaking the law, trying to get sent to prison on purpose, which we nearly did, but I didn't actually manage it at the time. I'm sure it might happen later. So I'll get over that. But going on hunger strike, you know, experimenting with doing criminal damage versus what happens if you sit in the road until they drag you out. Lots of different stuff. And broadly, a group of people had agreed to start this rebellion in early 2018. And it felt like what we were saying when we launched was completely ridiculous. I think its strength was its audacity. And we definitely weren't hearing anyone else say anything of this sort in the sort of broader climate space. There's a lot of people mobilised around climate change already. There has been for a long time. But nobody was going around saying, you're fucked and your kids are fucked. And they actually are. So can we do something about it? And everyone in that sort of like third sector, campaigning, charities, all of that kind of space, they'd be like, yeah, but you can't say that in public, you know. Like we say it at lunchtime, oh God, we're like so fucked. But we don't go out and make a banner that says it. And we were like, well, why not? Because you're not going to actually do what you need to do until you really feel how it feels to accept what's really going on. And it is totally terrifying. So we came out with this kind of messaging, which I think a lot of people found quite difficult because it wasn't what's allowed really in that kind of space. But we also wanted to like focus on stuff that would shift what we call the Overton Window. So when stuff happens in society, like the Queen dying, we were just talking about that, when obviously it's very embarrassing being English at the moment. Like it's even worse than just Brexit. And we know that when stuff like this takes hold of the public conversation and the public imagination, like it can change things. So the example I used to use was like when Donald Trump said, I'm going to ban Muslims, like before he said that, everyone would say the president of the United States of America cannot say that. But then once they do say it, everything's kind of slightly different afterwards. And the same as if you like cage children on a border, you say America can't do that. And then they do that. And then everyone's like, oh, well, I mean, they kind of do that. And like, the world's different, right? So we knew that if you go out and you cause enough trouble, you can move stuff around. It's not just, you don't just have to watch, you know, monolithic power structures kind of shift that around at their will. You can go out and move it together collectively. And heartbreakingly, like since we've started the movement, although I thought we were taking things seriously, I also don't think that any of us have taken it seriously enough, because the amplification of impacts in the last just few years is much, much worse than I thought it would be, or than I think most people thought it would be. And so in 2018, when we were saying it's going to be like this all the time, and this year it feels like it is like this all the time. And that was only about a 3-year window. So it's extremely important for me that whilst we're thinking about the work that we do together, and particularly the way that we speak about it and the way that we embody it, that it has some relativity to the fact that this is happening within our lifetime and indeed, you know, right now. And it still feels like everything's going in the wrong direction. Another reason why you could be extremely embarrassed to be English is because we've got an unelected Prime Minister who's declared that they're going to reignite the business of fracking, give about 100 plus new fossil fuel licenses, and as the still chair of the global COP process, probably not make it to Egypt because she doesn't think she's going to go. Everyone always goes, Britain's only 1% of global emissions, blah, 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 blah. But we still know that if we can shift the dial there, we can do something significant for the whole world. So it is still worth doing in our little stupid island. And this is the situation. So nothing's worked. And when we look at the increase in temperature and the increase in carbon emissions, the line that I should also have on this graph is GDP, because that tracks it exactly. So it's really important when anyone's talking to you about whether or not you can have loads of green growth, or whether or not it's really about population size, the actual track is on GDP, and you can be able to find evidence of that if you go online. So Exile's a mass movement. We use non-violent civil disobedience to demand action by government on mass extinction and to minimise the risk of social collapse through climate breakdown. That's the kind of short version. And as Renata said, we set it up to be a do it together movement. This is a slogan that we brought through the art department, but it was really it applies to the whole movement. Of course, you can just go and do an action by yourself if you want to, but it's really not as useful to anyone. You're much better off in collectives, in groups, and making sure that you're sort of working on stuff together. So it needs to be that kind of an ethos. Coming back to the art department, this is Miles's work again. So he's, as an artist, he sort of turned his work from making small sculpture to carving. And it only dawned on me when we started to see the work travel around the world that the approach that he'd taken was very English looking. But actually there's something very classical about the style of his drawings. There's also, as you probably know, something deeply historic about the tradition of printing and revolutionary movements. And those two things go hand in hand. You need to be able to produce your own stuff, your own propaganda, your own pamphlets, your own information. You need to be able to communicate. And so printing's got a long, long, rich history in association with movements and resistance. And moving on from the patches that we were doing before, which we still do some, there's also things that make like these print blocks, which you can take out on the streets and you can print things in situ on things that people already own. So we would make these big sets of blocks, sometimes as a big set, and then have people come in and finish and varnish. It's an enormous amount of work, but then you can make a little pack and you can send it to a local area, and then they've got their own little print studio and they can set it up, and it's extremely accessible and low skill, really, because you don't need screens and exposure and squeegees and all this stuff. You can easily do it out on the ground, and even if the blocks kind of dry up and get all cloggy, you can take them home and clean them and they're not totally ruined. Like a lot of printing equipment would not be able to survive that. So it's quite tough. So again, this is sort of thinking about how the work can like multiply and how people can make the stuff themselves. And then from those blocks you just saw were CNC. These ones have been printed on 3D printers and then stuck onto a back kind of board. So in that sense, our creative work sort of does this this nice dance, I think, between sort of being analog and then digitized and then being made into something three-dimensional again. And then maybe you send the print file to New York and they go and they send it to CNC person and they make a block. So it sort of goes in between and then it gets put onto a garment. So it's an interesting kind of play, I think, between the different sort of modes of of making artworks. And this is people out on the street. So we declared that all of our creative work would be for non-commercial uses only, and nobody can sell anything. Of course, there's lots of counterfeit stuff in the world. But the idea is that you can have access to these workshops for free, and then people give you a donation. And what I can also tell you is that if you ask somebody for money for something, they might go, oh, I don't know if it's worth that. And if you say you can have it for free and they've got £5 in their pocket, they give you more than what you would have asked for in the first place. So if they're poor, they can still have one. But if they're rich, they give you more money. I think it quite often tends to work out pretty well if you make a sort of pay what you can kind of set up for this stuff. It's less scary than it sounds in terms of thinking about models. So we made the creative work in a sort of pack that we gave away very quickly. In terms of branding, that was like, I guess, the antithesis of what a branding piece of work does. You make your Bible and then you like hide it from, tell everyone they can't use it and sue them if they do use it. We made a thing like that was designed to be given away as quickly as possible, which did actually really work at the beginning of the movement. It united it in a way that I felt quite shocked by, because you could have a protest in a country whose language I didn't understand, but I knew the banner was, I knew they were my friends. I knew that we would, I knew that we would get along. It felt like we could also feel that unity at the beginning. And the other thing that I think is an interesting design feature of the movement, which has helped it to be able to grow very quickly, is this idea of not having criteria for membership or signing up or payment. It makes organising extremely complicated because you just don't have a membership list anywhere ever, and that's quite annoying. But at the same time, it means that there's no barriers to entry. So again, this is like, in terms of designing the participation of people in a movement, you want to design the way that they can pick up and run with it themselves as much as possible. And so these principles and values, there's 10 of them. If you look on our website, that's the things that we hold everyone to. So if you agree that you can behave in these ways, you and your friend who live down the road can meet up and decide you want to go and do something, and you take a little flag and that's it. You are Extinction Rebellion. It doesn't. I don't get to say. No one else gets to say that you can't do that, so long as you follow these principles. And some of them by design are working really well. Some of them are really ambitious and I think don't work very well because they're too hard, but we have to hold them as like an ideal. Like we need a regenerative culture. You probably all heard the term burnout. It's very difficult to not burn out when you're an activist, especially if you have work at the same time and people have families and commitments and people are going to jail. The personal impacts can be a lot. The lack of money can be a lot. It can be very tiring, and finding a way to hold regenerative movement dynamics together is really hard. But I think it's important that it's on the list because it's a thing that we want to do, that we don't want to forget that that's our aim. Having things like reflecting and learning, again, like some teams do it better than others, but we do have a culture of doing a thing, reflecting on the thing, designing the next thing. So it came from this kind of process of iterative working, and people always are encouraged to debrief after they've done stuff and then talk about what can be done better and how we can fix things and make things better. Obviously, this all sounds really great and it's like good in theory, not always perfect in practice, but the design is there. Avoiding blaming and shaming has been really useful, because aside from the fact that it doesn't help to go out into the world and go, Donald Trump, it's your fault, because actually he's just one arsehole in the world and there's a lot more going on than that. There's also an application of that inside the movement. So we avoid with that, like having as much of a call-out culture as a lot of the broader left might have. So we used to have a statement that we read at the beginning of a meeting that says, please, if you've got a problem with somebody or if you've got an issue or rather than call people out on a public chat or on a big email thread or on Facebook or in a meeting, phone them up first, or ask for somebody else to come and sit with you and have a conversation with like 3 or 4 of you there. Ask for some support, but like talk to each other directly. That's a really, really, really useful thing. And I think a lot of this stuff wasn't designed by me, by the way. It was designed by other people. But the inputs that went into the beginning of the movement some of them were super smart. And I think that one has helped us to sustain, if that makes sense. So the movement exploded and it was hard to cope with. We saw lots of actions happen around the world, like this is in New York with a boat, and we parked a boat in the centre of London. People copied it in New York. They had a green one, we had a pink one, but it became like a sort of meme. So we were able to kind of, in some cases, create these kind of iconic visual actions, which then people could pick up because they could understand it, even though it's not, the message is not, maybe not obvious if you park a boat outside the main shopping area of Oxford Circus in London. But people did know what it meant. It was like, there's a boat out of water, it says act now, nobody can use the street for a week. I think we've made our point, you know. And there were other people like these guys, I think, these people in the bottom left, actually, if I remember right, they're in Pakistan. And to me, like the courage of some of the people who came out and decided to say publicly in different countries, I am a member of Extinction Rebellion, they were in really very much different circumstances to me, you know. Like, I was in a country which I've heard some people describe as a playground for civil disobedience. I mean, it's not anymore because they're changing the laws and they want to put us all in prison. But at the time, it shocked me how easy it was for us to get away with giving out loads of leaflets saying we're in rebellion against the state until something changes. Then to go on TV and say the same thing, and then to organise to shut down central London as successfully as possible with thousands of people for 2 weeks, and still no repercussions, really, apart from people getting told off for blocking a road and having a minor court case in a magistrate's court. So very low legal impact compared to what you might face in lots of countries where if you hold up a sign, you're in a lot of trouble. So obviously the global movement is quite varied in approach. Some places people do much, much softer stuff. Some places like the UK, I would say, is the sort of sharper end. We've had quite a lot of people who've gone and broken windows, myself included, of banks. You know, we face much more serious legal consequences now for those actions, potentially. We're just all waiting for court cases. But there are some countries where people are community mobilising. They're doing much more sort of constructive, regenerative, localised work. So if you look across the global movement, it's been interesting to see how it organically has like manifested in different places, because we don't have a central command who says, this is what you have to do. But in essence, what we put together was a kind of blueprint for how to start a colourful, non-violent civil disobedience movement. And if you want to do that, we'll give you all our resources, and you can change them however you need to according to your, you know, social and political context. And the last thing I want to talk about is the fashion stuff. So we did know that in the past, a lot of successful campaigns have disrupted a lot of cultural events. And obviously, famously in the UK, the suffragette who died underneath the King's horse. But aside from that, you know, people going into iconic places. And it felt, as a fashion person, it felt really clear to me that we should go and disrupt London Fashion Week, because it's an iconic cultural time and space, and it's also, you know, it relates so much to luxury, to exclusivity, to you know, qualities about the fashion industry which I can't relate to, and which I never really felt like I could, and which, quite honestly, I think some of them we need them to not be very prevalent in the world at all, where we're headed, because we really need to sort of pull together. So yeah, we went and did lots of protest outside, and lots of fashion designers and fashion professionals came into the movement, and they were really interested in how to do some work around this stuff, because a lot of people in fashion know very well, especially nowadays, how serious the impacts of our industry are, how much the industry is built on colonialism and continues to proliferate itself on the back of slavery, child labour, trafficked people, ecocide. The list goes on. And so what was beautiful, because obviously social movements, I say obviously, I think it's obvious, are really messy. The fashion people came in and they made it look really smart. And so previously we had our art team kind of trying to make all these banners and flags and things that would give continuity on the ground, because we knew that when people came and showed up at our protests, they were going to bring their sign about refugees' rights, or about saving the bees, or about their local ecosystems, or whatever. There was going to be all this sort of noise of like lots of different stuff, because we were making like an umbrella movement, really, that lots of things could come in underneath. And we were always the ones trying to sort of bring enough stuff to make it look visually unified and united on the ground. The fashion team got together and they did it perfectly well, and it was very beautiful. Fashion, which was something that was born out of an activist called Iggy, who unfortunately died. He was very young. He had a boycott against new materials and new clothing, because he knew that fashion was bad for the environment. But he didn't really know the fashion industry very well. So as this fashion group had grown, is that okay? Okay. As the fashion sort of focus had grown, there was a team for him to sort of pass that on to. And so they took it on, and to much anger, actually, in the fashion space, particularly in the ethical and sustainable fashion area, people didn't want to hear anybody say that you have to stop shopping, basically. And that's where we found ourselves, in conversation with people from Fashion Revolution, who were saying, but we're the good guys because we support workers' rights. And we said, yeah, but also the fashion industry is way out of control. It's way too big. And how can we deal with the climate crisis if we don't stop making 100 billion garments a year? Like, who are these things for even? Why are they all getting burnt in incinerators because we don't have anyone to buy them? What's that about? Like, do you want to encourage jobs for people to make those things? Like, we have to find a way around that. And what I thought was interesting about this was also the response was like emotional, because people were like, as if Extinction Rebellion is going to make a dent in the fashion sales of anyone. Do you know what I mean? Like, we all buy things in secondhand shops. Like, half the people are like up a tree in an anorak. Like, they're not like, these people are not shoppers, really, a lot of them. So, but it was the idea of it that sort of that hurt people so much. Like, but you can't take that away from. You can't be serious that we have to stop stuff. You know what I mean? Like, we make it better, tweak the edges, slow stuff down a bit, but you can't tell everyone to stop. And London Fashion Week had the same reaction. Like, you can't tell us to stop because we support young designers. So actually, you're being bad to young designers now by telling us we should cancel it. You're going to ruin the careers of these people who are going to come make these amazing new clothes, and they're going to change the world. And it, of course, is total bollocks. But like, that's what the place that you have to hit people in. And that's why I thought this was a really successful campaign, not because it did a big material impact, but because it really upset people enough to get them to have a really interesting conversation. And then we started to say, okay, how can we actually work with like people that are labour organisers? How can we talk about a just transition for garment workers in Bangladesh? Well, I still don't know the answer to that, by the way. But at least we're sort of going somewhere closer to the questions that we need to ask, rather than how can we get them 5 pence more an hour, and don't tell everyone to stop shopping, because I think we need to tell everyone to stop shopping. So that's it. I'll leave it there, and then we can do questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. We have a roaming microphone for questions.
Okay, is this on? Yes, okay. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm curious, beyond the activism and the protests themselves, like, have you been involved or could give examples of certain policy changes that you've seen in the fashion industry as maybe a direct response to, specifically in the context of fashion for this event, Extinction Rebellion, that you would say spurred, or that you're involved in, or that other members like got involved in, really affecting with, whoever is basically has the power to make change?
It's a good question. I think during, I can't remember which year because the pandemic's made everything feel really confusing, but I think it was in 2019 that we had something in the UK where there was a review that the government did on fashion, and they had people from the high street, from Zara, Philip Green, really bad people, and then like Christopher Rayburn and some nice people, some good people, some well-meaning people, spectrum. And they came up with this idea, because fashion was producing so much waste, that we should have a penny tax on fast fashion. And it got unanimously voted down. No way. Not a chance in hell of that going through. Which to me is an insult to the scale of the problem, right? If you see I don't know if you've seen that video series called Dead White Man's Clothes, about the garment industry. Look it up. Like really short videos. Basically, all of the waste from England, from France, from Germany, from all over Europe, all of our waste garments, and the UK is probably I think is statistically one of the worst for wasting clothing. But the whole of Europe is horrendous, and America is horrendous. We basically bale it up and send it abroad. So like when you put it in a charity shop or in a bin that you think goes to be for Oxfam or for whatever, most of it, about 70% of it, gets baled and shipped to places like Ghana. Some of it goes to Eastern Europe, but in England, you have different waste streams from different countries, but in England, most of it goes to East and West Africa and Eastern Europe. And so when you see that there are like mountains as high as these buildings of clothing that's on fire in a country that can't cope with this enormous weight of all of the waste that they get sent, which has also decimated their culture of textiles, and which has also decimated their domestic textile manufacturing market, and has also ruined their garment making market. A penny tax on Philip Green doesn't feel right, but the MPs were like, nah, no way. So that was a big signal. There is one thing that I think is interesting in the UK, which is an extended manufacturer's responsibility policy, which I think they've agreed to do, and it comes into force sort of like 2 years' time or something. So you have like this, what do they call it? Those like a grace. Sunshine period or something they call it, like a grace period. So you have time to prepare for the fact that as a supplier, you're going to be responsible for that material at the end of its life in some way. I don't know how they're going to work it or enforce it, but in theory, that's on the horizon. The only thing I will say about that might be a problem is that I think in the circular economy sense, I've noticed that quite often the conversations about sustainable system solutions within fashion tend to be so non-political that they're really, really stupid. And so people go, oh, it'll be circular, which means basically everything stays the same, but we like mash it all up and make it into a new thing again. and that's really good and clean because we don't put it in the ground or in the bin or on fire. But from there, you'll find quickly that like companies like H&M or big corporates who own a lot of polymer will then start saying, well, we could rent you the service of just owning a garment whilst you need to wear it, and then you can give it back to us. But to me, that has a massive risk that they then own like 40% of the world's polymer supply, and the global poor are continually indebted to them just in order to have a shirt on their back. So they'd love to have a service model. It's just they don't have the technology to make it work. But when they do, they'd love you to pay them a subscription instead of just own a thing. So I think these things need really careful thought from our space, because otherwise we campaign for stuff and then go, oops, it wasn't very good actually, because they're always going to seek out the most exploitative way to work with a new system. So yeah, there's inherent risk in all of it, if you see what I mean. I think that extended producer thing could lead us towards a place where there's basically it's a rentier model rather than a sell you cheap shit model. And I just don't know which one's worse, personally.
So a lot of people and designers obviously recognize the role of, fashion weeks and the new collections as being reactive or representative of our times and society's issues, right? But yet when you ask a lot of them about climate change, they always say, oh, well, it's not pressing, it's not here, we don't see it, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But in your movement as well, the importance of collective participation as a sort of bottom-up movement comes through, and art is very important in that as well, and creativity. What do you think, or how would you place or reconcile the power of the fashion as art in sort of communicating, society's issues with Extinction Rebellions and how they use that as well?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I just said to Dave, oh, maybe we could go and see that Schiaparelli exhibition whilst we're here, because I do like clothes, even though I sort of feel like I'm not allowed to anymore. But I suppose sometimes in this work we have to say things and we don't actually know the answer, or we don't quite know what reaction we want from the other person. But you need to say the thing that like no one else will say in order to try and sort of get the conversation moved forward. And I think that's true about non-violence, actually. Non-violence is a mode of like communication. It's a way of making space for a conversation that otherwise wouldn't happen. If I didn't go and break the window, then all of the people that work at that bank wouldn't have had a conversation about why the fuck did those women come and break that window, which is on a most basic level. And what we were trying to say to the fashion press, and certainly to higher like echelons of the fashion industry, for some time, was like, you produce culture, like you're part of a thing called the cultural industry, and I think fashion likes to tell you that it's art because it thinks that it's like music, or it thinks that it's like art, but it's actually also slavery. It's actually also big agriculture. It's also Monsanto. It's also factory farming. It's also all these other things. And so when you see those people who've got all that sort of capacity and money around them, the thing that I wanted to ask was a very similar question, really. Like, what can you do that's helpful? Like, because you are actually creative, you are actually intelligent, you are actually tuned into like where the public are at. You can like feel, I got into fashion because I felt like I could feel what was next. I was like interested in the fact that I felt like I was in the throes of a sort of collective psyche that like, yes, I know it's that shade of coral next and that's the thing that I'm going to make. And then lots of people are thinking the same thing. And that used to happen a lot without necessarily all of the sort of forcing of the trend prediction agencies saying this is the colour palette you will use and then you'll sell lots of things and you don't need to think about it. But it felt like there was a sort of collective sense of direction of travel, of like, where are you going? So there's like an attunement to the way that to where the public are at, I think, like culturally and aesthetically. And then there's like all of this like capacity to like make a noise and tell people, you know, we think this or we think that. Why don't we live more like this rather than this? And can't you use that space to do something helpful, you know? So I don't really know the answer to what to say that sort of really makes a good response to your question, apart from that I have the same question. And in a way, you know, one of the most interesting ideas that came out of some of the conversations I had with some of the people in the fashion space was like, if we need to do this thing called a just transition, which I don't think anyone really knows what that means because it's very big, then one of the main features of this concept is workers get to decide what they do instead. So if they're going to do something else, they get to say what that is. So they get to maybe have an assembly and talk about it, and then think about what to do. So they're not being told, you will move from doing this job to this job. And obviously there's lots of problems with looking at a globalised industry that like exploits the poorest people on earth and going over to those people in different continents and saying, you need to not do that anymore, so I'm going to give you something else to do because you're economically dependent on us, because that's also completely not okay, like, and it's not going to help us get out of the situation we're in, and it's ethically and morally kind of totally bankrupt. So what do you do? And somebody said to me, you just go and talk to the advertising industry because they're here, or go and talk to the people who work in like fashion magazines and say, you need to do a just transition. Because basically your job, you need to stop making magazines. Like, what if that was true? So then you go into those people who are very privileged, very wealthy, have lots of room to think and work, and say, you can change your career tomorrow if you decide to. Like, what else do you want to do? And I thought that's a really fun idea, to like go and take the just transition conversation to the most privileged people in our sector and say, the world is in total crisis. When it collapses, is anybody going to need your brand? Is anybody going to need your shoes? Is anybody going to need your, like, you know, £10,000 handbag? No, they're fucking not. What do you want to do instead? Because if you start thinking about it now, you might actually end up quite a lot happier than you will be if you're like still trying to sell a 10,000 handbag whilst, you know, whilst the world's run out of food because we've got a global agricultural crisis and hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced. You're not going to feel that good about yourself at some point in the future. So I think that's an interesting question, is to like, could we go to those people and say, what do you want to do instead? And I don't know what they'd say, but but if you get them on the right moment, on the right day, and you prime the space in the right way and you have them in a safe enough space, I do think you could have some really interesting conversations about it. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd love to ask you a couple of questions, actually. Thank you. So you were saying, you know, as an anti-capitalist, you don't like selling things. And I was thinking of that book by the School of Life, How to End Capitalism, and the argument there is that we just need to sell better, not things but values, than are currently being sold. And in a way, listening to you, one could say this is what you're doing. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, on, you know, tapping into, not selling stuff, but selling better and selling better values.
Yeah, I think that's way more interesting than selling someone a service. Like, as in selling them a garment they can only have for a bit. I guess the thing about values is that they sort of like they self-multiply, don't they? They sort of like they grow themselves. that's something that we did inside the movement at the start, was to say we want to build a movement that's based on virtue ethics. So people don't do stuff in our movement because it will definitely work. They do it because it's the right thing to do. And in our society, people go, I'll make it if it sells. I'll do it if it'll work. I'll do it if I win. I'll do it if it makes money. But there was, for a long time, a kind of lack of understanding, I think, around the idea of like people who are just purpose driven, who are just like, well, I just want to do this because it's the thing that I want to do. And there's always been like lots of people in society doing stuff because it's the right thing to do. But then it felt like it sort of got brought into the business sector and the sort of entrepreneurial sector, didn't it? Like purpose like driven, mission orientated, you know, all of that. And so in some senses, like I think that has been incorporated and maybe somewhat like sort of captured and co-opted in that space. But it was interesting to me to see in the movement how that failed to sustain itself as an explicit statement. Like we used to say to people, we are asking you to move into a virtue ethics orientation for your life. And it's basically like, I will sacrifice stuff for the benefit of the greater good. That's what I'll do. And I'll do it even though I don't know it's going to work or not. And that's kind of can be contagious in the right space. And then you find lots of people going, yeah, actually, I want to do that too. and then finding it like a real liberation in a way. Because if you don't need to be right or win, it's actually quite relief. So, you know, that's also interesting. But I think, yeah, in terms of, I don't know how you would, I mean, so one thing that's interesting about this, Renata, is that when I tried to give stuff away, people couldn't cope with it. So that's one bit of my experience that I think is interesting in the idea of trying to, if you were trying to sell something that was values, the denim jackets that we had, from the prisons, I said I didn't want to sell anything. And it was really basic because I was going, I just want to make the most radical clothes that I've ever made. And for that, it means that they can't be for sale. That's it. Like, it's super basic. I just couldn't think of anything smarter. I just thought this is a bit simplistic, but I just don't want to sell them. I don't think they can be for sale. And then when we had that thing on the park, I tried to give them away and people freaked out. They were like, you can't give me why are you giving it to me? I was like, well, because because I'm not allowed to sell it. And anyway, like I bought them for $10 or, you know, I bought a big sack of them. I'm like, we do a stencil on it and then you can take it, you can have it, just take it away, it's fine. And they're like, but it's not fine. I was like, but it is fine. And they're like, it's not. So like, that's also interesting about values because people couldn't cope with that. And it was quite an interesting, it was quite an interesting experiment actually, like trust and value and values, like how does that all relate together? Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have anything more clear to say about it, but it is an interesting space looking at those dynamics.
Thank you. Also, I mean, effectively, I think your talk, which comes to a lot of fashion communication students, was at the core about communicating through fashion for action, or through textiles, or through aesthetics or graphics, which I think makes it, highly pertinent for our community and sort of what we've been talking about. And I think in a way it also opens up a new field for fashion communication, using fashion as a tool to communicate or create collective action. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I think it felt lucky to me that we were doing this, I started doing this work. I actually, before we started the movement, was going to write myself an MA because I had a housemate who had done an MA, and I noticed that I had a card that got me in the same library as her. And I was self-employed, so I could make my own schedule. And I knew people in academia that I really respected that would definitely help me out. And I just thought I could write myself an MA and just do it, and then just ask people to give me some support and some office hours or whatever. So I was actually planning to draw up a program of study for myself, which got totally obliterated by starting XR. But it was going to be about that. It was going to be about this body politic project and about me trying to think much more deeply about what it means to use the body as a mode of communication. And in some senses, I've always felt like it goes back to quite a sort of like basic Marxist kind of, you've got nothing to sell but your labour, you know, you've got nothing to put advertising on but your body, you know, and you're competing in some ways with this world full of like chaotic messaging and advertising, and you get it pummeled into your face through your phone and from the streets and from the trains and from the buses and from the radio and from everything, and like how to sort of think about shielding yourself in something that like might help you defend against that, and also like stand up to it and be be an object with intent in the world, and like use your body in that way. And so it felt like a total coincidence that work was kind of ongoing, and then we started the movement, and it landed quite neatly into us going, we're going to do the art department stuff, you know, and then working with a couple of other people who, you know, Miles makes beautiful illustrations. Two other people, Charlie and Clive, did a lot of the graphic design work, made up the font, did lots of the other stuff. They also did all the digitizing of things and the arrangement of everything. So it was a collective effort, but we had this like whole project that we'd already been doing for several years that sort of made up like bam, it just sort of plugged into it. It was really it was really lucky, and but it also just felt like normal, just felt like that's the flow that we're going in. So yeah, I think there's if I hadn't been so busy trying to make the movement work in various departments and doing all the other stuff that I've been doing, I would have liked to have been way more focused on kind of, you know, getting into a bit more depth on why this is a good thing to do, how does it work, you know, what does it mean and where could it go next, in a way. Oh, no, I brought a jumper to show you. So that's like a jumper that you get given when you get arrested, and when you're in prison and it's really cold, they give you really horrible clothes that you take home afterwards. And so again, like I decided that it had to be sort of embellished, and you can't even stretch it. Like I don't know how you make jersey that's so solid. It's like quite an achievement, but you can't even pull the sleeves up anywhere at all, like not even a bit. It's really horrible to wear. So I cut it up the middle because I can't get it on and off properly. But so yeah, we started to cover it in stuff, and I think, you know, there's a lot of people in the movement who've got those garments because they've been held overnight by the police. Maybe they've been wet and cold or whatever it is. They get given these jumpers, and then they print stuff on them or they put patches on them, and then they wear them to court, to their court cases. With these things that say "Rebel for Life" across the front and stuff like that. So there's something very gorgeous about that to me. Do you know what I mean? The way that clothing has kind of like become important within the movement, and I think a lot of people in the movement kind of, they love it, but they also don't think about it in this kind of critical way. Do you know what I mean? So at its simplest, it means that, you know, you can walk up to somebody in a park in Amsterdam and say, "I like you," you know, because that can also happen. It's really nice. People have got something on their backpack and you're like, there's one, good one. But there's something much deeper and much more interesting about the whole thing, which is which I feel like I don't have enough time to dig into. So if you guys are going to think more about this, then please tell me what you work on, because I'm really interested.